just a minor technical issue here.
You can't see what I see.
Is that what you see?
Is it from the...
I don't understand. Does anyone know how to fix a projector when the laptop says something different than the projector?
Then you should
That's why I
restart.
need an IT.
Susan, should we restart the laptop or something?
That's what's on. That's not what's on the laptop.
Oh.
Okay. I don't know how to fix this. I'm very afraid to say. I guess we don't have handouts.
All AV can be parked.
I'm not sure. I'm just going to try a couple of function of fives.
That's what I was doing.
Yeah.
I did a function of 5. Yes.
We're very sorry. We'll be continuing in just a moment for all of you watching the webcast.
My day continues. Let me tell you about my day. So. Oh, that looks good.
But now you don't have.
Doesn't matter. I can see that.
You sure?
Yeah,
I can try at 5
that's okay.
again.
That's okay.
It's just.
I'm good. I can just watch. Okay. So what does an engineer have to do with? Well, first of all, I'm not actually an engineer. Now this is a cartoon somebody sent me. A friend of mine from the Netherlands sent me. Open mic night at the hospital. Well, that's me on the left. And I actually feel like that some days. That people are not always keen to hear my suggestions. So what I wanted to do, a little bit of overview, is I want to tell you a little bit about what I do, Center for Research in Healthcare Engineering. So my background, actually, I'm in optimization and scheduling and mathematics and applications of mathematics. And about 22 years ago, I did a project in particular that was looking at operating room scheduling and planning at Sick Kids, Sunnybrook, the General, the Western, and Sinai. And I realized how bad it was. How really, really bad it was. And back then, like in terms of, and from a systems perspective, so industrial engineering is also called systems engineering. You know, how do all the pieces fit together? And as most of you know, healthcare does not fit together at all. Nobody ever designed the healthcare system. It sort of happened by osmosis, and at any rate. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what we do there. And then I'm going to talk about 2 different things that we've done relative to aging at home services, which is the reason that I came to see you. So the center, like I said, I've been doing this for 22 years, and I've had probably close to 200 students who have done projects in healthcare, mental health, home care, hospitals, etc. And what was happening was about 10 years ago, people started calling me, and calling me up and saying, "Hey, Mike, can you help us out?" "Well, I've got a master's student starting in September. We'll get you an answer in about 1.5 years. They said, "Well, we were thinking about next week." I went, "Well, I don't have any people." So I started asking people if they would be willing to be a member of a center so I could actually hire some full-time staff that could get out and look at problems as they happen. So we created the center, and we are doing things right now. We're doing a lot of work with the Ministry of Health in Newfoundland. We've been doing stuff with Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan. We're doing stuff with CAMH, a whole bunch of different things. And I wanted to do this just sort of briefly, some current projects. And the only reason I'm doing this is because after I do one of these talks, somebody goes away and says, "Oh, you're the guy who does the GIS stuff." No, I do other things. So I just want to do quickly some of the other things that I do. So hospital operating room planning simulation. We've done this in about 7 or 8 hospitals so far. Hamilton Health Sciences are doing it everywhere. We did 4 hospitals in Saskatchewan, William Osler, St. Mike's. We're just starting at the General. Health Human Resources Planning started out about 3 years ago looking at how many cardiac surgeons are we going to need in Canada in 20 years. And most of the planning doesn't go beyond next week, right, in terms of, or at least the next election. So we actually did a model for the Canadian Society of Cardiac Surgeons on how many cardiac surgeons we need over the next 20, 25 years in terms of demand patterns. By the way, one of the things that scared me about that, we talk about the baby boomers. And one of the things that I realized when I did that is that the healthcare providers are baby boomers. They're all, so almost 50% of I know the age of every cardiac surgeon in the country. Almost 50% of them, 43% of them are retiring in the next 15 years. It scared me to death, right? So just at the time that the drive is going to for requiring more. Now some people say, well, we'll be doing it all in the cath lab. Never mind, that's another. I don't go there. We're done orthopedic surgery in Canada, oncology. We're currently looking at gynae oncology with Dr. Barry Rosen at PNH. We're looking at osteoarthritis, a model for osteoarthritis capacity in Alberta, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, looking at capacity planning, how many beds does the hospital need, currently looking at that with CAMH, ambulatory clinic planning. Women's College is building a brand new, they're about to open a brand new ambulatory center. They had little centers scattered all over the place. They said, well, is everybody going to fit? It's a mathematical problem. So we helped them design who goes where at Women's College and how many rooms they need and what days, etc. Did a similar thing at PNH. They have 350 ambulatory clinics. This is just the tactical plan about who goes where on which day. And currently starting at Sunnybrook and St. Mike's, chemotherapy patient scheduling, developing chemotherapy at Chervinsky in Hamilton and at Odette Center and cancer screening support, develop capacity planning for cancer with CCO, develop some models that they can use for, if we start screening more people, do we have the capacity to do it? Do we have the endo suites, for example? Waitlist management. We actually figured out in 2006, we figured out how many hips and knees and cataracts the province had to do so that 90% of people would get their surgery in 6 months. And by the way, in 2006, nobody had any idea how many people were on wait. Now they do. But we did it without any information. It was kind of fun. And we were off by about 1%, which was surprised me more than anybody else. Oh, darn. I hate it when I do that. I hit the wrong button. Yeah, I'm going to go right back to the top.
Oh, you did.
Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, I hit the end button instead of the next slide button. So now you're going to see my entire talk in reverse order. Don't you hate things like that? I told you, Murphy strikes. As I hit things in, yeah. Okay. Here we are. There we are. All right. Now watch out for that end button. Yeah, okay. Now, so this is a few years ago. So you are all familiar, I'm sure, with aging at home strategy. The ministry spent $1.1 billion on aging at home, and the idea was, if we can keep people at home, that would reduce the impact of long-term care homes. It would improve patient flow out of acute care, out of rehab, and ultimately it would reduce wait times in emergency departments. Nice trick if we could do it, but that was the basic idea. So they essentially gave money to the LHINs. The strategy was keep people at home, period. Like there was no real, how are we going to do that? Like that was sort of left up to the LHINs to decide. So with the Central East LHIN, we worked with the Central East LHIN, and they came to us and said, we got we got a pile of money, and so immediately they got requests for how to spend it. Give us an extra $30,000, we'll deliver more meals. Or give us another $3 million and we'll build more seniors assisted residence. Okay? And so they said, now we're trying to figure out just how to do this and what's the best way to organize it. Okay? And so they got tons of requests for funding. Like we said, we started with Central East. They asked us the question originally. And so the idea was how to evaluate. They wanted to come up with an objective way of evaluating requests. Which ones should they pick up, because they could only fund a small portion of the requests that were coming in. Right? And so the key services that we looked at were adult day programs, meals, transportation, supportive housing, and respite. And so what we did was we actually created, this is the example, and this is for the Toronto Central LHIN, this is the example for the adult day programs. So we created a map that showed by age and sex distribution what the expected demand is for adult day programs across Toronto. We met with people who run the programs, and they told us that in fact, looking at different levels of people with very low abilities can't go to adult day centers. You have to have a certain level, etc. So we got information from, wait for it, from the long form of the census. Oh. Anyway, my vote against them didn't help. Never mind. So we got it from the long form of the census. We got information across Canada by age cohorts, how many times they wanted to use each one of the services, including adult day programs. And then we interpolated that onto we had, like with the little census districts, we knew how many people were at a particular age group and sex. And then we said, well, if they have the national standard, this is what they'll require. So we came up with this map of the distribution of demand for adult day programs, and the dark red is high demand, and the light yellow is very low demand. So that's what what Toronto looks like. And then we looked at what the supply is. Okay. Well, the supply, for example, when we're doing Central East Lynn, there is an office in Peterborough that does transportation. Well, from where? How far out? Okay. So I actually have students call all of the major suppliers in Central East Lynn, the big ones, and say, how far out do you go? What's your catchment area? And we did it by streets and, make a box around it, etc., kind of rough. So we were able to capture, what the supply was. We knew based on MIS information how many people they served, and so we looked at the catchment area, so then we could turn that into a supply of services. So then we took, this is the GIS mapping, so then we took those two maps and overlaid them, and we said, here an area in particular in Toronto Central Lynn, this is an area of very high supply and no demand. This is an area of high demand and no supply. Where should you put adult day programs? Pretty simple. Okay. Now, if you believe we're making a ton of assumptions all the way through that, so this was the idea. So we did this for the Central East Lynn, and one of the things that the Central East Lynn said was they intuitively knew where adult day programs were needed, where they weren't, etc. They didn't need our software to do that. However, when the suppliers came and said, why aren't you funding our program? There's a need for this out there. They said, well, look at the map. Like there's an oversupply in that area. So they actually found that very useful in terms of their objective adjustments as opposed to gut feeling, thinking about, etc. So we were actually going through at a quantitative level, which is, and I try not to push that too far. I'm trying to add quantitative support to decisions without getting too far into it. Okay. So it was initially done for Central East Lynn, 2008, 2009. So then we showed it to all of the other Lynns, and they said, oh, we want one. Okay. Did I mention all the calling all the suppliers? So yeah, so we actually did this for all 14 Lynns. Each one of them has their own tool. And then, and so we built it for all 14. We called all the suppliers in all the areas. We looked at all the demand. We used the same kind of demand estimates. And then just most recently, within the last 6 months, we created a desktop tool that all of the Lynns, they have at their own disposal. And there's a whole bunch of things they can play with, how they display them, how they break down the category. What's dark red versus what's light yellow, etc. So how would you like to split it out? We've thought about, now this has just got age and sex breakdowns. A lot of the things, health is determined by, the average economy, etc. So we could put things like that in there. But did I mention the long form? Never mind. Okay. So the second one I wanted to tell you about, the second project that's sort of related along the aging at home. So I had a meeting about 5 years ago with a fellow by the name of Peter Biasucci. Peter, I don't know if you know Peter, he's in the Health Policy, Health System Strategy Division of Ministry of Health. And so Peter and I are sitting around the table, and Peter said to me, he said, Mike, what I'd really like is I'd like a model of the healthcare system. Well, when I stopped laughing and got off the floor, I said, well, Peter, that's a really great, I'd love that too. That's a super idea. But, you're going to have to be just a little more specific on that one. What do you mean by that? Because you mean all kinds of things. And he said, well, for example, Mike, he said, We actually just went out and spent, at that time it was the beginning of aging at home, so we just committed to spend $1.1 billion on aging at home, and we have no idea what the performance measures are. We have no idea whether we're going to come along at the end of 3 years, did we get $1.1 billion worth of value? And how would you measure that anyway? So he said it would be really nice if I had a model that I could go through and test it out and say, based on, you know, I implemented this policy, what do you think we're going to get out of it at the far end? So I had a PhD student sitting beside me at the time. He was just starting his PhD, Ali Asensoy. And so I said, oh, sure, Ali can do that. My students hate it when I say stuff like that, right? And so 5 years later, Ali is getting very close to having actually done that. So I'm going to show you a snapshot of a model of the healthcare system. And what we decided to do was we decided to focus specifically on aging at home. And the reason we decided to focus on aging at home, we said, well, first of all, we would like to be able, that was the original question, you know, can we go back? Now, nobody really cares anymore about whether aging at home was cost effective or not. I counted 4 different committees. I'm sure there were more within the ministry that were trying to figure out whether it was valuable or not. I'm sure you guys have had some experience with some of those. But we've tried to focus on that because we know that there was a major infusion of cash into specific programs. And so we can now go back and historically, retrospectively look and say, well, what was the impact? How many more patients? How did patient flow increase? How did it change? What happened to long-term care census? So we can actually go back and measure these things so we get a real measure. Because it was a major infusion, we expect major impact. So from us, from model building, that's great because now we've got something to actually measure by and compare to. And besides that, what we're focusing on is the flow of seniors through the model and through from acute care and rehab into the long-term care, home care, and even we've actually got individual caregiver burden as one of our variables in our model. And so because all those things are in there, in fact, we did this again with the Central East Lynn, trying to model their flow. The Central East Lynn has a lot of new questions that have nothing to do with aging at home, but in fact our model has got a lot of those. But we do focus on seniors. One of the things I want to do when I finally graduate Ali is to look at other things like, we really haven't included things like mental health, haven't included primary care, etc. So in our model, we want to be able to model performance. So it's what's the flow between these two things. So if you know, what's the capacity on the flow from here to here? You can't go over there until this one's empty. Strategies, so we want to focus on senior services. We're piloting at the Senior Lynn. And we're looking at our model. We don't look at individual hospitals within the Central East Lynn. We're looking at, we take all the hospital beds and put them together in one lump. We say, how many beds do you have in the Central East Lynn? Who cares where they are? So, and how much capacity do you have in long-term care? How much capacity do you have in terms of numbers of people, etc.? So to create a high-level model, we've got very high-level measures. And there it is. Okay, now I want you all to memorize this because there's going to be a short quiz now. Okay. And so what we've done is we've got flow variables that if you increase the number of beds in a particular area, or if you increase the capacity here, you're going to improve, it's going to have an effect on other variables in the model. So this is just simply the impact, the relationship between various variables in the model. There's actually another model which is much more spaghetti-like than this. And I'm going to show you a little example to try to take some of the mystery out of this. Nobody's actually going to use the whole model. What we're going to do is focus on a little corner of it. But you see it's got variables within the acute system, within long-term care, rehab, complex continuing care, home community care, and informal caregivers. And all the way through there are some of these variables that are flow variables, the blue ones, some of them are performance measures, how are we performing, and other ones are policy levers. And that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to focus on levers. What can the LIN do and actually have an impact on the system at a sort of a strategic, large level? What can the ministry do? How can they affect policy? This is supposed to be a policy model. sort of a high-level strategic model. So for example, on the flow variables, we have acute to CCC referrals. So how many complex care, continuing care referrals are there? On the performance measures, we have average length of stay in hospital. Now this is global across the whole land, average length of stay for everybody. And on levers, so some of the levers, so we have long-term care home, home to home care diversions. Okay, is one of the policy things. The policy they can divert people to home by providing more home services, for example. And so what I'm going to do, just to illustrate how this works and how the things work, I'm going to focus on a little corner of the model over there and blow it up so you can actually read the darn thing. And so in particular, we're going to focus on the impact. I mean, one of the things that the ministry would love to know is what's the impact from, the problem with long waits in the emergency department is all to do with alternate level of care. We have people locked in the wards, they can't get out, and because those beds are fixed, we get bed blockers in the emergency department, etc. So if we could just solve the ALC problem, ED wait times would go away. Well, I'm not so sure, but never mind. Okay? So we have the average length of stay, one of the variables, the average length of stay, average ALC length of stay in a hospital. And our model, all it does, this is a qualitative model, it's not quantitative. Ali's trying to make it quantitative now, that's another story. This is the qualitative model. So all it says, if the average length of stay, if we could make that, if we could change that, then average length of stay generally in the hospital would go the same direction. So if we increase ALC length of stay, we're going to increase average length of stay. So the S means that these two variables move in the same direction. If this goes up, that goes up. If this goes down, that goes down. And that's all this model does. If average length of stay goes up, then the acute load in the hospital goes up. People are staying longer. It's harder to get people out. If the average length of stay goes down, the acute load in the hospital goes down. If the acute load goes up, then the elective admit rate goes down. We have trouble admitting people because our beds are full. If the elective admit rate goes, up, then the acute hospital volume goes up. If it goes down, this goes down. Okay? So we have the model, and then we have Murphy's Law. So if the acute load goes up, the ED to hospital admit rate goes down. It becomes more difficult to admit people from the emergency department into the hospital. If the ED admit rate goes down, acute hospital volume goes down. So this is just at a very basic level. All we're doing is we're saying, what are the variables that the ministry can play with, and what impact is that going to have, etc. And so then we build on this a little bit as we sort of expand out on this model, and we look at, well, if average length of stay goes up in a hospital, it's actually going to make the health status of people at discharge go down. If people stay longer, they actually get sicker. So when they discharge them, they're going to be worse off. So when they show up into rehab, the rehab referrals, they're going to be worse off, right? So when people have when we have stroke people, they spend too much time in the hospital before they get to rehab, they deteriorate rapidly. So the rehab referrals go, and if the rehab referrals go up, that is actually going to acute ALC to rehab is going to. Yeah, so people are staying longer, and therefore the flow out of here is going to take longer. Okay? And we start adding things on the outside. So this thing, you see how this model starts to build up and blow up. The way we came up with this model, by the way, was we built our own little model in a corner and said, this is how we think these things are related. And then we called in people from the Lynn and the ministry, and they said, what do you think? And so they started adding variables. And we said, okay, now just focus on the things that are important. And then we got expert panels. So we got an expert panel from the acute sector. We got an expert panel from the home and community care sector. And an expert panel from the institutional sector. And said, what do you see here? What are we missing? One of our theories was that, in fact, we call this a cross-sector model because we feel that there are people who understand the acute sector pretty well. They haven't got a clue what's happening in long-term care. And they don't understand, they just say, you know, if those guys could smarten up, you know, all of our problems would be solved, etc. Right? So we were trying to capture those relationships between the different sectors and also looking at the things within. But we didn't build a model. People told us, the experts in each one of these areas told us what the key variables were and how they were related. So then, started out with a little model, and we build it out and build it back. You start to get a picture of how this starts to represent, and we're talking about average length of stay in all hospitals in the Central Eastern. And then once we get that, we can then start to turn that into a quantitative model. I actually put numbers on it. Its orders of magnitude is, you know, how much is this going to go up if that goes down? Well, we've got, like I said, we've got some examples from the aging at home, because you put a pile of money into this thing, you change this thing dramatically, and we can see what happens. Right? I don't mean for a minute that this is going to be correct, but it's going to give us an idea of which way things are going. So our model, so the model was split into the 5 sectors, and for each of these sectors, the model contains feedback loops. You know, things are going around in little loops, inflow and outflow dynamics, all kinds of things. Ali did most of these slides for me, so if I stumble my way through it. Okay, so start building this model. So then the ministry came along and said, you know, like, I wonder if we can use this model. Now, it's just a qualitative one. We don't have the quantitative one. So this was last year. And they said, you know, we're looking at a particular policy. And the particular policy they were looking at in our alternate level of care in hospitals, there's a lot of complex continuing care patients. Those are the ones that have the really, really long length of stay. We don't have enough CCC beds. Right? We can't and when people get in there, they stay there for a long time. So the flow through CCC is very slow. So they came up with this idea and said, well, we've got low tolerance, long duration. So some of those CCC patients, actually the better ones, perhaps we could take those patients and instead of sending them to a complex continuing care bed, we could put them into a rehab bed, but they can't tolerate the high demands of full rehab, but they could get some rehab. They could get like an hour a day instead of 4 hours a day of rehab. They'd be there for a lot longer, but you know, maybe we could, some subset of the population we could pull out. Now that would actually free up our ALC problems and free up a lot of our other issues. So that was sort of the idea. So they said, okay, now what impact, if we insert that into the model, what's it going to tell us about what happens? Well, if the low tolerance, long duration availability, so if that goes up, if we create extra capacity for those ones in rehab, well, first of all, what we're going to have is we're going to be sending more people to rehab. Well, they're going to steal capacity out of rehab. So in fact, the rehab capacity is going to go down. Low tolerance, if these ones go up, rehab shared resources pool is going to go down. Like we're not going to have as many rehab beds. We're going to be stealing them from somebody else. If the availability goes up, the CCC population, the ones who are in ALC waiting to go to complex continuing care, we took out the healthy ones. We left the ones that are sicker. So in fact, the average frailty of the CCC patients is now going to get worse, which means they're going to stay longer in the CCC beds, right? And the acute to CCC referrals, so the number of patients that are sent from acute hospital CCC is going to go down, which is fine. Now, this is how policymakers work. Like, this is what they actually do. They sit there and say, well, if I do this, what are the direct consequences? In our model, we can actually go through and say, this is how we fit it into our model. And in our model, what we can do is we can actually start doing paths and chains and say, well, the change that's going to affect that, and that's going to affect this, and that's going to affect this, and that's going to affect this, etc. So in fact, this is actually going to have unintended consequences down the road. And the software we use actually allows us to go through and trace it out, right out the way through, right out to the end. Okay? So we started looking at, so for example, if we do low tolerance, long duration, so we increase that in a rehab hospital, and I'm going to try to, so unintended consequences. So one of the things that's going to happen is this is actually going to increase the number of patients who go, these patients, when they are better, when they are judged as being reasonable, they're going to go to a long-term care home. So in fact, instead of staying in a CCC facility, they're actually going to wind up in long-term care. And so in fact, the referrals to long-term care are going to go up, and long-term care home waits are going to go down. People are going to be waiting longer to get a long-term care bed. And that is going to reduce rehab throughput. Rehab throughput is going to start to slow down. Okay? If rehab throughput slows down, it's going to slow down the referrals from hospital to rehab. This isn't very good. Okay, now it seemed like a good idea, but in fact, as you start peeling away the layers of the onion, it's not so pretty. So what can we do about that? Well, one of the things we can do is one of the problems is we've just taken away a bunch of rehab capacity. So one of the things we can do is we can try to increase rehab capacity, and one of the nice ways of being able to do that is to do more outpatient rehab. A lot of people in rehab hospitals could be living at home and coming in just for daily visits for outpatient and then go home at the end of the day. It's not funded properly. We had changed the funding rules. But we could increase outpatient rehab capacity, and that would actually help some of these problems that we're getting. Unfortunately, rats. It's a resolution issue here. We'll have to imagine. I hope it isn't going to be too serious. Anyway, so outpatient, if we increase outpatient capacity, one of the things that happens when you increase outpatient capacity, and I'll pretend we can see the bottom of that. One of the things that's going to happen is that people who would have been in a rehab hospital are now at home. Well, if they're at home, that's going to increase caregiver burden. The caregivers are going to have more responsibility. Well, when you increase caregiver burden, what happens is the caregivers say, well, I can't take this any longer, so you're off to a long-term care home. So by increasing caregiver burden, you really have to watch out for that, because that's going to produce, that's going to actually have more referrals to long-term care, which is going to make long-term care waits even worse. Okay? So, you have to sort of watch what you do and watch what's happening. So, what can I do about that? Well, what I can do about that is I can provide more respite care, more respite for caregivers. Okay? If I provide more respite for caregivers, I'm going to reduce the caregiver burden and balance off the fact that we've got more people being treated on an ambulatory basis from home. So in fact, you start out with something that actually bears no relationship to that, and and this was with Ali sitting with a couple of policy people, and well, then what happened? Oh, whoops, we don't want that. Well, what if we do this? Oh, we don't want that. Well, what if we do this? Well, that makes sense. So now we have a story, and the story is no longer based on little edges in our diagram, which they do very well. It's now based on paths. When we presented it to the ministry about a year ago, there were about 60 people. We had like a lunch and learn thing at the ministry. And one person in the audience went, holy smokes, you mean I'm working on a policy, and Joe over there is working on a different policy in a completely different area, and because of this, I can tell that what he's doing is going to have a negative impact on what I'm trying to do, and I can see it. And they have no capacity for doing that right now. Is the model right? Who cares? You guys should be talking, right? So it's so this was, and Ali's done this a couple of times with a couple of different policies. And so all of the things that we can do in the policy, and remember, this is a policy model. Like we're not trying to, this isn't a cost model. We're trying to understand what the impact of aging and health strategy was. So in our current work, what Ali is trying to do now, and there's a much deeper model beyond that. I've got the flow from acute care to rehab. Well, now what we want to do is, in order to make that quantitative, I actually have to split that out by patient population, by age and sex groups. I want to separate out the stroke patients from the orthopedic, the hip replacement patients, etc., to understand, because when I'm doing policy changes, I'm affecting specific populations. So to make this thing quantitative, we actually have to add a lot more layers to this you don't even want to know. But underneath it all, it just got this very high-level model. So Ali has been working away, and we hope to be finished the quantitative part in the next. Hope we can graduate him this summer and get him finished. And one of the things, so in the model, one of the things that we do as he's put quantitative side to it already, and what the model tells you is that if you set the parameters a certain way and you introduce a policy, then it produces these scenario maps, and it says, here's what's happening over time in days to each one of these indicators when you introduce a certain level, and we can run a number of policies and have them, if you do this, we get the green line, if you do this, you get the blue line, which one's doing which, what impact is this having on these other variables within the model, on other performance metrics. You can just, you don't want to see, like I say, you don't actually want to know what's happening in the whole network. What you want to do is focus. There are 6 things that I'm interested in. When I increase this, what happens? And then we have little sliders up here that the policymakers can play with. And they can say, well, if I increase my discharge rate from, I change the percentage of people that go to CCC beds versus rehab, and I increase that, what impact does that have in the model over time as we move through the next, the next 5 years or 10 years? Right? And these are all sort of things that we can play with. At the moment, we need somebody who's who has some serious expertise in playing with the model in order to be able to set this up and build it up so that policymakers can work with it. And this knowledge translation, knowledge exchange part, this is always the part that sort of kills us. We're working on it. Okay? This little slide here, I don't know if you can see it, but the mathematician at the board, and in the middle it says, then a miracle occurs. And the caption at the bottom that you can't see is, I think you have to be a little more specific about step 2. Right? Now, I call this Mike Carter solves the healthcare system. Right? I'm on my way, right? But anyway, thank you very much. I'm open to questions. Yes?
The model you described there, that's just for the Central East lane right now, or is it pan-provincial?
The qualitative model, effectively, the qualitative model is somewhat universal. Like it's provincial. That the impacts of these variables are throughout. Oh, I'm sorry, getting a little too close to that. The impact is pretty universal. Now, when we're building it, we're going to build it specifically with the dollar values from the Central East Lane. Yes.
Really?
But I'm hoping that what we're trying to do is that if you increase the capacity, you spend this many dollars on this, what was the impact in the Central East Lynn? Presumably, and these are all sort of order of magnitude. So presumably, we would have the same reaction if you did it in a different Lynn. Now, granted, the Toronto Central Lynn, the cost ratios are going to be a whole lot different than they are in the Northeast, right? But,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If getting those cost numbers is, like he's talking about thousands and thousands of edges and relationships, and these are all just sort of mathematical equations that says, this is equal to this times this, and we've done a fit, and this is what it looked like in the data. So we do regression to try to pick up things that are reasonable. Once we get it working, yeah, we should be able to apply it anywhere.
Is there any thought of moving to including HR requirements?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm trying to remember if we did already. Yeah, I'm trying to remember if we did already. Many of the and many of the policy variables or the control variables, the flow variables have to do with, you know, it may be beds or it may be staff, you know, it may be health human resources, absolutely. And especially when we start to get into things like I say, we avoided primary care, we avoided mental health for the time being, but certainly that has to do with capacity and in terms of people. But at a very gross level, like, you know, because we're adding up all of the people within that group in Berlin. Yes?
I saw you use the term qualitative model. I didn't see any qualitative characteristics in it. I saw really quantitative characteristics. You're not talking about quality of care. You're assuming certain care centers have certain qualities, but that's highly questionable. So could you explain why you're using the term qualitative?
Yeah, I'm qualitative has nothing to do with the impact of quality. You know, and in fact, quality is real hard to measure. And we say if from a and I apologize. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm using this in a modeling sense that we talk about. A qualitative model is a model that doesn't have numbers. So I know that if I increase the length of stay, things are going to slow down in the hospital, and my elective rate's going to go down. No idea by how much. So we call that, and that's just the terminology thing, we call that qualitative and just to distinguish it from I have no numbers. So quantitative means that I have an estimate.
I know.
Qualitative means I don't. It has nothing to do with the quality
True
of care.
qualitative issues.
Sorry?
It hasn't anything to do with qualitative issues.
No. No, it just
It'd be
it
nice
just means
if
it's
you
a.
came up with a better term.
I didn't honest. I didn't invent that. I mean, that's like a.
I'm not
Yeah, I know.
suggesting.
And that's when you cross disciplines, right? Like
Yeah.
and people use a word for one thing in one discipline, another in another, right? I try to be cross-disciplinary, but don't always work. Yes?
I was just wondering how this model would suit areas that are not urban, like the far north or you know, different parts of Ontario that are not as populated.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in many respects, first of all, one of the things I like about Central East Land is that Central East Land carves out a chunk of Scarborough, high dense population, and it goes up to Halliburton. So a very low dense population, right? So it has, and because we're doing it geographically, it has all those components in it, which is kind of nice. I actually think it's probably easier to do something like the Northeast Lynn than it is to do Toronto Central. Toronto Central is, like, first of all, its catchment area is the province, if not the world. And so it's really, so when you get into dense urban areas, it actually becomes more difficult. It becomes easier, but that's just a theory. Like Central East Lynn is, we kind of like it because it's a bit of a blend and a halfway between. But you're right. I'm only speculating. We haven't actually tried it yet. I mean, the Northeast Lynn, for example, is Thunder Bay, and so it's it's done out of one center, and people come in or services go out, and so in fact it's really, in some ways it's easier to model.
But your north, the more rural, some of your variables are going to become more important, such as transportation.
Yep.
And more complex to deal with.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, how do we do Meals on Wheels or volunteer transportation in the far north? Well, that's.
And the issue of caregiver burden. The issue of caregiver burden would be a lot different because you wouldn't have the CCAC.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I'm not suggesting we could take the Central East Lane and absolutely, I'm not suggesting we could apply that to the Northeast. We'd have to do a complete new analysis to understand what the quantitative impact, and if I may continue to use the term qualitative because I haven't got a better one, having been severely chastised. Yes.
From your work as a ministry,
what would you estimate your level of buy-in at the ministry level would be or will be once the model is finished? Will people actually use it at what level, and will it be implemented? And the reason why I asked is about 30 years ago, there were fantastic models on traffic flow and issues within traffic flow of metropolitan Toronto and outlying areas. The models were all there, the facts were all there, nobody implemented them.
And I mean, and models have, you know, models, there's a lot of skepticism. You know, there were models in the early 90s on how many doctors we needed in Ontario. And the models turned out to be really, I mean, the assumptions, you know, models have a ton of assumptions, and the assumptions turned out to be wrong. And, you know, medical schools cut back on enrollment due to the models, and with the disastrous consequences. So I think that there are a few people. I mean, we're not really at the point yet to go out and you know, say our model's right, believe us. We are hoping that we will be there. Well, we've got I tell people that you know, I used to be a mathematician and now I'm in marketing, and you know, everything I do is trying to convince people that this is actually a reasonable thing to do, and that it's you know, it's not, you know, it's got a list of assumptions as long as your arm. But if those assumptions are true, then this is probably what will happen. So you pick the assumptions and play with them. So I'm hoping we get there. We certainly have a few people in the ministry who have seen it, who think that would really be cool. They remain to be convinced, and there are some very, very strong skeptics. Absolutely. And why not? They've been burned before, right? So that just because Mike Carter said. So ask me that question again in about 2 years.
Okay, do you have any plans in place as to how you can increase the implementation, how you can
I mean, like,
the acceptance?
yeah,
I
so
know that's, like you said, more marketing than anything else.
absolutely. And I mean, right now, we're trying to finish off to get the quantitative part of the model working to the point where they can use it, and we are trying to engage the policy analysts in the Health System Strategy Division in coming and sort of, okay, we've got this model, you guys are working with this policy, let's see if we, you know, what impact it would have, this is what it tells us. And in a sense, like, I built the model because of what the experts told me, and if they want to change it, that's fine too, right? So I don't agree with that. That's not going to go up. It's going to go down. Okay, make it go down. Knock yourself out, right? So, so I think in a sense we've given them a structure. But I mean, what we're hoping to do is sort of get a number of other scenarios, like the low tolerance, long duration scenario, which I think is what we're trying to need. If we have a number of other examples like that where we actually used it, where we got more quantitative, then I'm in a position to go out and start marketing it. Right now, all I can do is talk to you guys and hopefully generate some interest. That's kind of fun. And nobody has done anything like this anywhere. So this is you know, this is truly sort of groundbreaking insanity.
What could you see as an obstacle?
As
As an obstacle to the use of this, and I'm seeing budgets,
point.
that would lead to some people fighting the implication of your model.
Absolutely, and you know, I mean, policy is all about, like, it's all about you know, I gut feeling and intuition, and if the model disagrees with their intuition and will in places, people will immediately write it off. And I mean, I think that you know, like I say, a lot of the assumptions in here are going to be wrong, and I think it's going to be a real challenge, you know, convincing people to use it, to give it a try. And and I always try to emphasize that I'm not trying to tell people what will happen. I'm not trying to predict what will happen. All I'm trying to do is say, when you put in low tolerance, long duration, you should really think of the impact on caregiver burden. And are my numbers right? Who cares? Is that something you've thought about? Is it something you plan? And, so my model sort of shows you some of the unintended consequences that you should go think about before you implement the policy, which is something they don't have now. And if it only does that, if that's as far as it goes, then I think it's been a success. If people don't believe when we get to more quantitative, they don't believe the magnitudes, the changes, the impacts, etc. The original question was, did we get value out of $1.1 billion? No idea what the model is going to tell us. A lot more people stayed at home. What's the value of that? I want to stay at home. So I think it's the jury's still out. But I'm this, in a sense, this is something that I've been fighting for 22 years, is to try to get people to use quantitative models. And for example, one of my favorite examples of this was I was doing work at Hamilton Health Sciences. They had with cardiac surgeons. They had 3 cardiac operating rooms, and they were opening up a 4th. And so we were asked to help them with simulation modeling to figure out how they should assign docs, given the number of ICU beds they had, the number of ward beds they had, and the problems of how should we schedule surgeries. And so we came up and we built a simulation model and say, well, if you do it this way, this is what's going to happen. And in a sense, we had sort of this one date. All the doctors accepted their schedule was going to change as of June 1st. And so they were okay with that, which is an unusual thing to get doctors to move. Everybody was okay with that. And there were 5 surgeons, and one of the leads, the chief of surgery, cardiac surgery, Kevin Tail, he was working closely with my student who was trying to model this. He was very skeptical. And then after about 3 or 4 weeks, he got it. He sort of got it. This is actually going to help. And so I remember that we were at a meeting in Hamilton, 7 o'clock in the morning. All 5 surgeons were there, and one of the surgeons was sitting across the table and asked me a very confrontational question, And Kevin answered. And I went, and everybody just shut up. Like everybody and now they're implementing the model through all services, through Hamilton, etc. But it really is, just because the model says, it's a very difficult step, but this is sort of my life. That's why I say I'm in marketing. And I mean, this one is monstrous compared to the OR schedule in cardiac surgery. So this is a giant step, and I have no idea whether it'll be. I'll come back in 10 years and tell you how. We still haven't got anybody believing it. We'll see. That'd be fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Pardon? Oh, I will. I thought you. Yeah. I hope this will be popular.